All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Justin, and I'm here to present this work on behalf of Xiao, who unfortunately couldn't make it, but I'll do my best. This was also joint work with Shankar Iyer at Facebook and Naaman at Cornell Tech. So before I start, show of hands, how many people here are involved in some sort of online community, whether it's Facebook, Reddit, Discord, LiveJournal, Usenet, or an online forum? All right. So if so, then this talk may be useful to you or your community leaders. So a growing body of research suggests that people are hardwired to be social. And in general, people tend to want to form groups, be in groups, and interact in groups. And this happens both offline as well as online, with one platform among many being Facebook. And on Facebook alone, over 1.4 billion people use groups every month. So our research is motivated by a simple question that doesn't have a simple answer. So what makes a good group? And there are many ways to define good, and to that end, there's been a line of work at CHI that's focused on designing for meaningfulness. But for the purposes of this talk, we're going to focus on just one aspect of goodness: trustworthiness. And to slightly rephrase, when do people trust their social groups? And a better understanding of the conditions under which people are more likely to trust their groups can help inform the design of better systems and help communities build and maintain greater trust among their members. So why study trust? So trust has been studied in psychology and sociology since the 80s and even earlier. Trust is associated with several desirable outcomes, including greater economic growth, institutional development and quality, as well as life satisfaction. And in particular, trust in groups has been found to increase group cohesion, reduce conflict, and improve task performance. But however, a lot of what we know about trust in groups is based on either theoretical work or small-scale offline studies. And while some work has studied the determinants of trust, again, these have tended to study individual factors. So coming back to the question that I posed earlier, today we want to try to better answer this question of when people trust their social groups. And we're going to examine trust in groups in three parts. So first, we're going to define trust and how we measure it. We're going to look at the determinants of trust in groups. And then we're going to look at whether perceptions of trust in a group can predict what will happen to the group in the future. So to start things off, what is trust in groups and how do we measure it? So trust can be defined as a decision to be vulnerable to another party. And in some seminal work, Roger Mayer and his colleagues identified three primary characteristics that lead to trust: ability, a belief that others are capable; integrity, a belief that others share the same sense of justice; and benevolence, a belief that others are looking out for you. Trust can also be measured at different levels or different scales. So one can look at trust between individuals, or dyadic trust in organizations, or trust in societies as a whole. Research on trust in groups kind of falls in between research on dyadic trust and organizational trust. And here we're interested more in groups as a coherent entity of users, and this work contrasts with that studying organizations, which has tended to be more concerned with trust relation to organizational structure and job performance. So how do we go about measuring trust in groups? So to measure trust in groups, we first sampled individual group pairs, surveyed these individuals on their perceptions of trust with relation to the group, and then augmented this information with aggregated log data. So specifically, our sampling procedure involved identifying people who are active members of active groups and then randomly selecting person-group pairs, such that no individual appears more than once and no group appears more than once as well. The survey itself consisted of three main parts: questions on individual differences, questions relating to trust in groups, which was our main focus, and a question on group category to better understand what type of group the user was involved in. So in part one, we asked individuals about their general tendencies to trust people in society and other factors that past work has suggested relate to trust. So these are things like disposition to trust, general social support, general risk attitude, and general in-group loyalty. And for all of these questions, participants answered them on a 5-point Likert scale. In part 2, we developed the following scale based on measures of trust in previous literature, but adapting them to trust in groups. These include care, reliability, integrity, and risk-taking. Consistent with other studies that use similar dimensions of trust, these dimensions here correlate well with each other, and the questions are internally consistent. So we're taking the simple average of these dimensions to obtain a composite trust in group score. And to understand and control for group category, we also asked participants to label a group as belonging to one or more of the following categories: friends and family, education and work, interest-based groups, identity-based groups, and location-based groups. And this taxonomy was developed based on previous qualitative research at Facebook. So in all, we received over 6,000 completed responses in total, and this was only restricted to the US. And we then combined this data with de-identified aggregated log data about the individual and the group to study trust in groups. So next, what predicts trust in a group? So based on prior literature, we looked at several different potential correlates for a total of 6 feature sets containing 30 variables in all. So the first 2 feature sets relate to the individual. These include demographic variables such as age and gender, and from part 1 of the survey, we also then have an individual's general trust attitudes. The subsequent 4 feature sets relate to the group or an individual's interactions in that particular group, and these features include basic group properties such as group size, privacy type, category, also things like how long someone was in the group. And as activity levels may contribute to trust, since social interactions provide opportunities for people to get acquainted and become familiar, we included features like time spent, number of posts, comments and likes with respect to both the individual and the group, as well as average across the group as a whole. We also looked at group homogeneity as measured by both the age and gender entropy in the group, and this is because homophily is closely related to trust. And previous work here has found a relationship between age and gender, homophily, and trust on Airbnb. So last, we computed network structure-related features based on the subgraph induced by the friendships between members in the group. And using all of these features, we can build a random forest regression model, which was able to predict trust with reasonable performance, getting about R-squared of 0.06 and a mean squared error of 0.53. So to give you a sense of what this actually means, a classifier that just predicts the mean achieves an R-squared of 0 and an MSE of 0.73. So there's lots more in the paper about each of these different findings, but for time I'll only focus on 2 feature sets: the basic properties of the group and the group's network structure. So next we want to ask, how do basic group properties relate to a person's trust in the group? And these simple measures already can tell us a lot about how trust relates to groups. So first, and perhaps as you'd expect, trust decreases with group size. So as a group gets larger, you tend to trust the group less. And if we fit a line in the plot, the trust composite score on the y-axis and the group size on the x-axis, we find that trust indeed does decrease with group size. But if we split the data into groups that are public and groups that are private, so meaning that they have closed membership policies or secret groups, we find that overall private groups do tend to be trusted more. But do you see how these lines get closer as group size increases? So in fact, if we run t-tests comparing trust in groups of a minimum size, starting at n equals 0 and increasing n from there, at about n equals 150, we find that the difference is no longer significant. So in other words, if we compare public and private groups that have at least 150 members, there's no significant difference in how much trust people perceive in them. So 150 is notable because this also happens to be Dunbar's number, or approximately the number of stable relationships an individual can have on average. So in other words, as the size of a group increases past about Dunbar's number, there's no additional trust to be had by making a group private than if it was just simply public. Trust also varies with group category. So here is a chart with average trust in the group on the y-axis and group category on the x-axis. So how might trust differ in these different categories? So based on prior research, given that tie strength correlates with trust, we expect close friend groups to be trusted the most and on average, more so than interest-based groups. Prior work also suggests that maybe location-based groups such as neighborhood or local organizations should have relatively high trust as well. So what do we find? So as it turns out, while close friend groups are indeed trusted the most, location groups are actually least trusted. More research here is needed, but one reason might be that in contrast to local community organizations that prior work refers to when you talk about local groups, many location-based groups on Facebook may be transactional in nature. So they're like buy and sell groups or maybe groups where people are looking for temporary housing. So next, let's look at network structure. So here's how we construct a group network. We treat each member of the group as a node. An edge exists between two nodes if two members are friends on Facebook. And using this graph, we can then derive the group network statistics and use them as features as well. So these include things like degree centrality, or how many people a person is friends with within that group on average. We also looked at the average local clustering coefficient in the group, and at a high level, the clustering coefficient measures how tightly knit one's friends in the group are. We also looked at the density of the group, or the ratio of total existing friendships among group members to the number of all possible friendships within the group. We also examined other measures, such as the network's K-core decomposition, as well as other measures of tie strength, such as mutual friend count. And in all cases, we find that larger values of these network statistics correspond to increased trust. And this validates previous work that postulated that triadic closure in networks encourages cooperation and social norms, and thus also likely promotes trust. So to give you a sense of how trust varies with these network features, here's again a chart with trust on the y-axis and group density on the x-axis. And so what this is basically saying is that as the proportion of people in the group that know lots of other people in the group increases, that trust also increases first rapidly and then more slowly. So I've told you about some features, but if you consider all of them together, which are the most important? So here's the relative feature importance of each different group as measured by the average increase in the mean squared error where the feature set is removed from the prediction model. And it turns out that two sets of features are a lot more important than the others. So first is a person's general attitudes towards others. So in other words, what this means is that if you tend to trust others more in general, you're also more likely to trust a specific group. So that's kind of pretty obvious. But at the same time, we also found that the network structure also explains a significant amount of variance in an individual's trust in the group. This second observation is notable for two reasons. First, that the group network structure contributes to trust is consistent with prior work on the structural cohesion of groups. We show here that these findings that were on smaller networks not only generalize across groups of different sizes and diverse categories, but it's also a strongly significant predictor of trust in groups. Second, and perhaps more useful from an application's point of view, that this is also somewhat easily computable and importantly measurable without a survey, unlike an individual's trust attitudes. So by just looking at the connections between people in a group, you can really have a rough sense of how trustworthy this group is to its members. So we just showed how different factors, particularly network structure, can predict trust in groups. But why is knowing trust in groups useful? So can we use trust in groups to, say, predict future group outcomes? So we'll look at two today: tie formation, or whether an individual in the group will form new ties with existing members, and future growth, whether new people will join the group in the future. And to do this, we compare the state of the group at the time of the survey to the state of the group a month after, with respect to the trust in groups measure derived from the survey. So first, let's look at tie formation, which we define as whether the survey participant had at least 1% more connections with any other group member in the month following the survey. So to put this simply, did the participant make any new friends in the group? So we conducted this analysis by grouping groups, pun intended, into quintiles. On this chart, the y-axis corresponds to the percentage of groups where a participant had at least a 1% increase in within-group ties, and the x-axis corresponds to the level of trust. And so as you see here, in general, higher trust does correlate with higher likelihood to gain more within-group connections. We also verified this finding using logistic regression, where we controlled for features such as group size. So if a group is trusted more, people in the group tend to form more connections with others with the group in the future. But how about future growth? So here we define growth as whether the size of the group increased by at least 1% in the month following the survey. So like before, the x-axis corresponds to the level of trust, And the y-axis now corresponds to percentage of groups, which added at least 1% in new users. And here, we see an opposite trend, right? So as trust increases, groups are less likely to grow more quickly. So why does this happen? So we know from prior research that groups that are more connected are less attractive to join, perhaps because they tend to be more cliquish. And so given that most measures of network connectedness correlate with trust, groups with higher trust are thus less attractive to join as well. And this actually suggests some potential tension between maintaining trustworthiness and wanting a group to grow quickly. So those were our findings, but then there's a lot more in the paper and a lot more research to be done in this space. So our findings are not causal, so more research is necessary to understand if the relationship between trust in a group and the variables we identified are causal. And while this work focuses on Facebook groups, future work may involve studying groups on other social platforms. These findings may also inform the design of systems. For example, recommender systems that incorporate trust may end up recommending groups that are smaller and less popular. And last, while trust in the group is one important measure of goodness, there are many more that we've yet to study. So in summary, we find that people trust smaller, denser, more clustered groups, that network structure is a strong predictor of trust in the group, and that trust in turn can predict group outcomes such as future growth. Thank you, and I'll take any questions.
So hi, Bart from Clemson. So I haven't read the paper yet, but you definitely convinced me to go read it. So that's good. But one thing that I want to ask for my interpretation of the results is when you say this increases trust or trust has an effect on this. Now you mentioned that you had three types of trust, right? The benevolence, integrity, and what was the last one? Competence. Thank you. So I'm wondering, when you say trust increases X or X increases trust, did you consider like a sum score of those aspects, or was it like one of those aspects, and was it a different aspect every single time, or were there particular aspects that were more influenced or more influential? Can you say a little more about that?
Yep. So the question was on how we measured trust, and whether, since trust is made out of several different components, whether we are actually talking about individual sub-measures instead of the general measure of trust when we talk about our results here. So first, when we say that trust increases X, or that X is related to trust, I've been trying to be careful about being clear when there's a distinction. So when I say trust has a relation to this, we don't know which way correlation goes. When I say trust increases this, we have more confidence that trust probably does have an effect in that direction. And overall, for like all of the results, what we did was that we averaged all four dimensions of trust that we looked at, and we looked at that composite score in relation to all of the things that we studied. We also, in the paper, there is also a little bit of analysis on how these individual measures vary as well, and so there are variations of like different things that are a bit more correlated than other things, but I didn't include that in the talk for time. But you can definitely like peruse the paper and learn more about all these individual measures as well.
Yeah. Hi. Hello. Hi, I'm Diego from Northwestern. Thanks for your talk. I'm more curiously about your analysis of the networks, because you are using mostly like individual metrics to just create those conclusions about the network structure. But I'm not sure like if part of your analysis consider like more structural properties of the network, since like the triads or just like the configuration kind of centralization, decentralization, and obviously all the dependencies that can have like those individuals. Because, for example, I'm not sure how you're controlling clusters and also at the same time the size of the network. Like I will expect like most closeness is just like when you have high coefficient of clustering, it's just like a small group of groups, and that's also what's referring to the first slides. So I don't know if you can tell us a little bit more of that.
All right, so the question was about group network structure and whether we consider other possible group measures that kind of reflect more the general structure of the group than just the individual. Am I getting that?
The structure of the network, right.
Yeah, the structure of the network. So again, this is really just like maybe I'd say like just the top part of like all of like network science, and then we only looked at these like simple network theories. I think you make a good point that a lot of these measures are correlated with one another as well as with group size as well. So what we do in our regression set is that we do try to control for group size as well, although that's probably not going to account for like all of the difference as well. And so I think there's definitely value in looking more at the network structure more deeply, perhaps in a separate piece of work to understand these possible differences as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's thank our speaker again, and let's thank all